Hi, I'm Lady Saelym.
And I'm Madam Omen.
Join us as we dive deeper into Galveston's history. Pirates and storms, true crime and tragedy.
And the lore and legends that were born from it.
We're not here to tell ghost stories. We're here to uncover where they started.
And what never fully let go. And who stayed behind.
Beyond the past, because history doesn't rest, and neither should you.
Well, hello, everyone. If you've been wondering where we've been, well, the answer is pretty simple. Tour season. And if you've ever worked in tourism, you know exactly what I mean. 1 minute it's Monday, and the next thing you know, it's 3 weeks later, and you're wondering what the heck happened. Well, Historic Galveston Ghost Tours has been wonderfully busy, and I am so incredibly grateful for that. It has, however, made it very difficult to schedule some podcasting.
Juneteenth was coming up, and I remember calling you and saying there is absolutely no way we can skip this story. Not here, not in Galveston, not when one of the most important chapters in the history of Juneteenth begins right here on this island.
This story matters. But then came that dangerous question. Hey, Omen, can you write it? Because I am completely booked.
After listening to Lady Saelym make this look effortless for months, I discovered something. This is much harder than it looks.
Oh yeah, it is definitely not as easy as people think.
Right, so I started researching. The deeper I dug, the more complicated this story became, because like many people, I thought I knew the story about Juneteenth. I mean, I knew the version that most of us are taught. Freedom came, people celebrated, the end.
Yeah, well, that's the version most of us learn. It's nice, it's neat. But you know what? History, it is not usually nice and neat.
It's not. At first, that is the script that I wrote. It was accurate enough and respectful and sufficient. Then I started reading newspaper accounts, historical records, and research papers. The more that I read, the more apparent that it became that this story was anything but simple. This wasn't a neat ending. It wasn't a single moment where everything just changed magically overnight. It was complicated, messy, painful, and ultimately human. To truly understand all of those complexities, we'd probably need to do a deep dive series on the Civil War, Reconstruction, and all of the things that followed. There is another reason that this story did grab me, because while it does begin in Galveston, it actually reaches my hometown in Fort Worth, Texas. Honestly, that made this one feel a little personal. At the time, I knew that Opal Lee was important, and I knew that she was called the grandmother of Juneteenth, but I don't think I truly appreciated the scope of her story until I started researching this episode. The more I learned, the more I realized she wasn't just a part of the Juneteenth story. She's one of the people who helped carry it forward. And through her story, we've discovered that Juneteenth isn't simply about freedom being announced. It's about a promise. It's a promise that's remembered and carried forward, and a promise that still asks something of every generation that inherits it.
So tonight, we're telling you the human version, the messy version. And guess what? It begins right here in Galveston in the summer of 1865.
On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. However, the order could only be enforced where Union forces had control. Texas remained largely beyond Union authority throughout the war. As Confederate armies lost ground elsewhere, many slaveholders moved into Texas with the people they enslaved, hoping to keep slavery alive for as long as possible. By June of 1865, an estimated 250,000 enslaved people remained in bondage in Texas.
As Union armies pushed deeper into the Confederacy, enslavers looked west towards Texas. It was remote, difficult to reach, and for those trying to keep slavery alive as long as possible, it looked like a safe place to run. So thousands of enslaved men, women, and children were forced into Texas during the war. Many had already separated from family once. Some separated again. Imagine hearing the rumors that the war was changing everything while being marched further and further from home, further from freedom, and further from the people that you love.
Yeah, and during long days of travel, uncertainty, illness, exhaustion, and just watching everything familiar disappear behind you, not knowing where you're going, not knowing when the journey would end, not knowing if you'd ever see the people that you love again. We may never know the exact conditions that each person faced along the way. What we do know is that this journey was not their choice.
And by the spring of 1865, roughly 250,000 enslaved people remained in Texas. The Civil War was coming to an end, Confederate armies were collapsing, and news was spreading. People heard the rumors the Confederacy was losing. Change was coming. But for many enslaved Texans, daily life, well, it hadn't changed at all. The work was still there. The control was also still there. And so was that uncertainty. Freedom had been declared more than 2 years earlier, but a declaration and a reality, well, those aren't always the same thing. Freedom had been promised, but now people were just waiting to see if that promise would ever arrive.
I've often wondered how many people believed the rumors. I mean, would you trust them? Would you even dare believe that freedom was coming? Hope can be painful when it arrives too many times and never stays.
After departing New Orleans, Union Army Major General Gordon Granger and roughly 2,000 Union soldiers arrived in Galveston on June 19, 1865. They carried with them the authority of the federal government and a military order that would change countless lives.
Galveston was still recovering from the war. People were exhausted and the future was uncertain. And then the ships appeared in Galveston Harbor. Among them was General Gordon Granger. He hadn't come to negotiate, he had come to enforce a new reality. And for some, those ships represented freedom. For others, defeat. But for everyone, it represented change. And standing along that harbor, no one could have known that a military order issued that day would still be remembered more than 150 years later.
History often announces itself quietly. There's no dramatic music and no narrator telling people that they're living through an important moment. Just ships on the horizon. And the people that are watching are wondering, what happens next?
What followed was General Order Number 3, issued by Major General Gordon Granger.
The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labour. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere.
Most people remember one line from that order, that all enslaved are free. And the order didn't stop there. It described a new relationship between former enslavers and the formerly enslaved. It was an official announcement that one system was ending and a new one was beginning.
Yeah, and the order promised freedom, but the future would determine what that freedom meant.
For many newly freed people, one of the first questions wasn't, "Where do I go next?" It was, "Where do I find the people I love?" Some families found each other again, but many never did, because freedom could open the future, but it could not always restore the past.
Yeah, that part stays with you. How many people spent years wondering what became of the people that they loved?
There were practical questions too. Where would people live? How would they earn a living? What rights would actually be respected? General Order Number 3 promised equality, but reality, as we all know, was much slower to catch up to that. Some formerly enslaved people stayed and negotiated wages. Others left in search of family, opportunity, or safety. And many quickly discovered that freedom on paper did not automatically erase prejudice or resistance. Some enslavers refused to accept the emancipation. Some delayed even announcing it. Others tried to maintain control through intimidation and violence. The war was over, but the struggle, well, that was a long ways away. For a time, there was a real hope that the promises made in 1865 might actually become a reality. Across Texas and the South, formerly enslaved people built schools, churches, businesses, and communities. They weren't waiting for permission to build better lives, but progress often meets resistance. And the decades that followed showed just how hard some people fought against equality. Laws changed, rights were restricted, a promise survived, but it still remained unfinished.
And somehow, Juneteenth did survive. That may be the most remarkable part of this story. Not the freedom that was announced, but the memory that endured.
If nobody tells the story, eventually it just disappears. And Juneteenth was never guaranteed a place in the history books. For decades, many Americans outside of Texas had never even heard of it. There were no federal observances, no national recognition, no Black communities remembered. But year after year, families gathered, churches celebrated, stories were shared. History was passed from one generation to the next because it mattered. And in many ways, remembering became an act of preservation.
That's something that we understand a lot on this podcast. History survives because somebody tells it again and again, long after the people who lived it are gone.
Exactly. And that's why Juneteenth became more than just a date. It became a tradition, a community memory, a story carried from one generation to the next. And that's when our story leaves Galveston. Because memories don't survive on their own. They survive because somebody's carrying them on. And eventually, that story found one of its most dedicated caretakers in Fort Worth. Omen, take it from here.
Absolutely. Fort Worth, Texas, June 19th, 1939, 74 years after General Order Number 3 was issued in Galveston. 12-year-old Opal Lee was preparing to celebrate Juneteenth with her family. Her family had recently purchased a home on Annie Street in the south side of Fort Worth. For many families, a home represents stability, security, and a future. But not everyone welcomed them. A mob gathered outside their home. Hundreds of people. Windows were broken, furniture was destroyed. Their home was burnt down. Her family was forced to flee. This was on a day that was meant to celebrate freedom, to celebrate progress. For Opal Lee, it became a reminder that the freedom promised and the freedom experienced are not always the same thing. Many people would have turned away from that memory. Not her. Opal Lee carried it with her. And decades later, she would transform it into purpose.
You know, we talk a lot about history and we usually focus on the big moments, the battle, the speech, a signature. But most history survives because ordinary people keep showing up to tell the story just one more time. Not only do they tell it, but they teach it, they share it, and they refuse to let it be forgotten.
And that may be exactly why Opal Lee's story resonates with so many people. She wasn't a president. She wasn't a general. She wasn't a celebrity, not then. She was a teacher, a counselor, and a community leader. And this is a woman who believes some stories are too important to lose. For decades, she spoke about Juneteenth. She organized events, she educated children, and she shared history. She reminded people that June 19th was more than a date on a calendar. It was a reminder of promises made and promises delayed, and promises that were still being pursued. As the years passed, Juneteenth celebrations continued to grow. Texas passed legislation recognizing Juneteenth in 1979, and it became an official state holiday in 1980. Yet much of the country still knew very little about it. So Opal Lee kept going. Not because it was easy and not because it was popular, but because she believed that this memory mattered.
And that's what I find inspiring was her persistence, the willingness to spend years working towards something you may never ever see completed. Dr. Opal Lee understood that real change is often painfully slow, but she also understood that if people keep moving forward, eventually progress will catch up. And she never ever stopped moving forward.
In 2016, at the age of 89, Opal Lee launched a campaign to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Her effort became known as a 1,400-mile journey from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C. One of the most meaningful details was not the total distance, it was the number 2.5. Throughout her campaign, Lee walked 2.5-mile increments in cities across the country. The distance symbolized the 2.5 years between the Emancipation Proclamation taking effect on January 1, 1863, and the arrival of General Order No. 3 in Galveston on June 19, 1865. For Dr. Opal Lee, every step served as a reminder that freedom had been declared. But for many Texans, it took 2.5 years for that news to arrive. Supported by more than 1.5 million petition signatures, her campaign helped bring national attention to Juneteenth and contributed to the movement that ultimately led to federal recognition in 2021.
2.5 miles for 2.5 years, a distance you can walk, a length of time that's much harder to imagine. Every step became a reminder that freedom had been declared, but it had not reached everyone at the same time. And that is part of the story that's really worth remembering.
89 years old. Most people are being told to slow down, it's time to rest and take it easy. Opal Lee looked at the story that had been carried for generations and decided that it was her turn to carry the lantern a little farther, step by step, conversation by conversation, and signature by signature. She kept walking, and eventually, people started listening.
History survives when people decide it's worth protecting. And for decades, Dr. Opal Lee did exactly that. One conversation at a time, one walk at a time, one generation at a time.
On June 17, 2021, Juneteenth became a federal holiday. Among those present at the White House was Dr. Opal Lee. She was 94 years old. For decades, Lee had advocated for broader recognition of Juneteenth through education, community outreach, symbolic walks, and a petition supported by more than 1.5 million signatures. More than 156 years after General Order No. 3 was issued in Galveston, the story had reached the highest levels of national recognition. Yet, the story did not end there. In 2024, the Annie Street home, destroyed during the 1939 attack on Lee's family, was rebuilt and restored as a place of remembrance. Dr. Lee, then 97 years old, was present to witness it. More than 8 decades separated those two moments. Few historical narratives are afforded the opportunity to come full circle within a single lifetime.
For many Americans, it was the first time they'd heard the story. For others, it was recognition of something their families had celebrated for generations.
For Dr. Opal Lee, it was the culmination of decades of work, not the end of the story, a milestone within it. Because history doesn't stop, and neither does the responsibility to remember. The easiest thing in the world is to forget. The harder thing is to remember, especially when remembering requires honesty.
Tonight's story began right here in Galveston, with ships entering the harbor and with words that changed lives, words that promised freedom, equality, and words that would be tested by reality. Because Juneteenth is not a simple story, and it isn't a story where everything changed overnight. It's a human story, a story of progress and setbacks, of courage and perseverance, and of people who refuse to let a promise disappear. And the people who heard the General Order No. 3 are gone. But the story, it still remains. Not because history preserved it, but because people did. Families, churches, teachers, communities, and people like Dr. Opal Lee. They carried it forward until it reached us today. And now the responsibility has become ours, not simply to celebrate, but to understand the people behind the story, to remember their struggles, to honor their perseverance, and to remember that freedom is not just something won. It is something protected, something strengthened, and something that is passed on from one generation to the next.
Perhaps that's the true legacy of Juneteenth. Not just a holiday, but a promise.
A promise that was spoken right here in Galveston, Texas, carried through generations, and still remembered today. Thank you for joining us on Beyond the Past. Until next time, keep listening for the stories that refuse to be forgotten, because history doesn't rest.
And neither should you.